The boy did not ask permission. He simply crossed the waiting room, climbed onto the plastic chair beside the stranger, and pressed his face against the man's arm, the way a child presses against something warm without thinking about it. "You fixed our furnace," he said, "2 winters ago. You sat on our kitchen floor for 3 hours and you sang the whole time." The stranger looked down at him. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of hands that carry evidence of work in every knuckle. He had never met this child. He was almost certain of that. Across the waiting room, Vivian Ashford stood up from her chair with a speed that had nothing relaxed in it. She was dressed in the particular way of someone who has money and has decided that money should not be the first thing you notice, which meant the first thing you noticed was money. Her eyes moved from her son to the stranger with an expression that did not stop at suspicion. "Bennett." Her voice reached the security desk before she did. "This man needs to be removed." But the boy, who was perhaps 7 years old, had already taken the stranger's hand in both of his and was holding it with the focused grip of a child who has decided something and does not intend to be argued out of it. His name was Theodore Vance. He was 41 years old, and he had driven to Lakeshore General that morning for a pre-employment physical, a requirement for a new contract with the city's utility infrastructure division. He had arrived early, signed in, taken a number, and sat down in the waiting room with a paper cup of coffee and no expectations about the next 2 hours beyond mild boredom. He was not thinking about the past. He had learned, across years of sustained effort, not to think about the past during working hours. There was a version of his life that he had put in a drawer and learned to leave there, not because the contents had stopped mattering, but because taking them out too often had a cost he could no longer afford to pay. He had a daughter. Her name was June. She was 9, and she had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, a combination that had been responsible for more than one standoff over vegetables. June was in school right now. He had packed her lunch that morning, a thermos of soup, an apple, a note she would pretend to find embarrassing and read 3 times. His life was structured around moments like that. It was a good life. It was a life he had built carefully from materials that had no room for waste. His wife, Sandra, had died when June was 4 months old. A brain aneurysm. The kind of thing that happens without warning and without negotiation, and without any provision for the person left sitting in the hospital hallway holding an infant in a car seat, trying to understand the information a doctor was attempting to communicate in a way that kept failing to land. Theodore had understood it eventually. He had gone home and sat on the kitchen floor for a long time, and then he had gotten up because June was still in her car seat, making the small sounds of a baby who has been patient long enough. He had not, in the years since, described himself as a single father to anyone who had not already observed that fact directly. It was not a performance he felt the need to give. He raised June, he went to work. He learned the specific vocabulary of a 9-year-old girl's emotional landscape with the same patience he brought to fault diagnostics in a complex HVAC system. He understood things by paying attention to them. It was the only method he had ever found reliable. That Tuesday morning, sitting in the waiting room of Lakeshore General with his paper cup going cold, he was thinking about a faulty pressure coupling in the city's East End boiler station, which he had been asked to assess as part of his contract evaluation, when the boy sat down beside him and changed the nature of the morning entirely. He looked down at the child. The child looked up at him with a complete absence of self-consciousness. "What's your name?" Theodore said. "Finn," the boy said. "You don't remember me." "I was 5, Finn," said the woman who was now standing 3 feet away, and the single syllable had the quality of a door being closed very firmly. "Come here." Finn did not come. He tightened his grip on Theodore's hand and looked at his mother with the expression of a child who has encountered a situation he finds more important than whatever consequence is being implied. The security officer arrived. He was a young man who looked uncomfortable and asked Theodore politely, but with the practiced directness of someone following a protocol, to please come with him. Theodore stood. He placed his paper cup on the chair beside him. He looked at Finn, who was now watching him with the specific quality of attention children apply to things they have decided not to forget. "It was good to meet you," Theodore said. "You sang an old hockey song," Finn said. "The whole time you were fixing it. Mom made you tea and you said thank you 3 times. Theodore looked at the boy for a moment. Then he followed the security officer. They kept him in the small office near the service entrance for 25 minutes. A woman from hospital administration came in halfway through and reviewed his appointment confirmation, his ID, and the referral from the city contracts office. Everything verified. The security officer apologized in the careful tone of someone who understands he was following a reasonable instruction, and also that it had turned out to be unnecessary. Theodore collected his jacket and walked back through the main corridor. He was not angry. He had been in rooms like that before, had been asked to explain himself in institutional spaces where his presence was viewed as requiring more justification than was applied to other people, and he had learned that anger, in those situations, was expensive and rarely changed the outcome. He explained himself clearly, let the facts speak, and moved on. It was a method that required a particular quality of stillness that had taken years to develop. He was almost at the exit when he heard footsteps behind him, not the boy's, not the quick light rhythm of a child, but measured and deliberate and slightly faster than comfortable. Mr. Vance. He turned. Vivian Ashford was alone. She had, he noticed, left whatever composure she had been assembling in the waiting room somewhere between there and here. She looked different in the corridor, less armored, though the armor was still visible underneath. There was something in her expression that was not an apology and not quite an accusation either, but occupied the territory between them with a kind of uncomfortable precision. "You're listed in our service records," she said. "I checked while you were in there. You serviced the furnace at our Rosedale address." "November 3 years ago. I've serviced a lot of furnaces," Theodore said. "Finn doesn't do that," she said. "What he did in there, he doesn't attach to people. He hasn't since his father died. The therapist has been working with him on it for 2 years." She stopped, as though she had said more than she intended to, and needed a moment to assess whether continuing was a reasonable decision. Theodore waited. "He was 4 when it happened," she said. "He doesn't have many clear memories. He has feelings attached to things, not pictures." She looked at him steadily. The furnace job was 2 weeks after the funeral. Theodore stood in the corridor and thought about that November. He had been doing residential service calls that month, a routine contract with a heating company he'd worked with, on and off for years. He remembered a house in Rosedale with a furnace that had a cracked heat exchanger and an owner who had clearly been putting off the call for longer than was advisable. He remembered a kitchen floor, a complicated repair, a woman who had brought him tea and whose eyes had the particular quality of someone not yet fully present. He had not known at the time what had happened to her. He had known something had because grief has a specific texture in a room, and he had become, by that point in his life, very familiar with it. He did not remember a child. "There was a boy," he said. It was not a question. He was organizing a memory that had been stored in the peripheral way of things that are not the main focus of an experience. "He was in his pajamas," Vivian said. "He came downstairs and sat on the kitchen steps and watched you work for an hour. I thought he'd fallen asleep up there." Something shifted in her expression. "He told me afterward that you seemed like you knew what to do." He said it in that very specific way children say things that they don't have the vocabulary for yet. Theodore was quiet. He had a policy about not filling silences that someone else needed. "I'm not apologizing for having you removed," Vivian Ashford said. "I would do it again. But I am." She stopped. "He asked me your name before I could stop him from asking, and one of the nurses had seen your ID. What do you need?" Theodore said. She looked at him as though the directness of the question required a moment to process. "He lost something when his father died that I haven't been able to give back to him," she said quietly. And I don't know what you did in that kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night that made a 4-year-old boy feel safe enough to sit on those stairs for an hour without making a sound. But I would like to understand it." Theodore said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about June at 4 months old in a car seat, and the kitchen floor, and the specific quality of stillness that a person can inhabit when everything has become very simple because there is only one thing left to do. "I probably sang," he said. "I do that when the work is complicated. It helps me keep track of where I am in a sequence." Vivienne Ashford looked at him for a long moment. Then, because she was a woman who had learned that the most important decisions in her life had been made in corridors and waiting rooms and other places that were not designated for decisions, she said, "There's a coffee place across the street, if you have time." He had time. His appointment had been rescheduled, which the administration assistant had informed him of, with an apology that he had accepted without comment. They sat at a corner table. Vivienne set her phone face down and did not look at it, which Theodore noted, because he had met enough people who occupied rooms while remaining elsewhere to recognize the difference. She told him about Bennett Ashford over the next 40 minutes, in the straightforward way of someone who has told the story enough times that the telling no longer costs as much, though the cost had not gone to zero. Her husband had been a commercial pilot. He had died when a cardiac event occurred during a layover in Calgary in a hotel room, alone at 52 years old, 6 weeks before his planned retirement. The cardiac issue had been undetected. There had been no warning. There had been a phone call at 2 in the morning, and then there had been the long arithmetic of a life being reconstructed from different materials. "Finn doesn't really remember his face," she said. "He has photographs, which is different. What he remembers is," she paused, turning her coffee cup slightly in its saucer, "feeling completely certain. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Bennett had that quality. You walked into a room with him and things seemed manageable. Finn lost that." She looked up. "I've tried to give it back in every way I know how to, and I don't know how to give back something I'm not sure I carry." Theodore listened without interrupting. It was something he had learned to do well, the same way he had learned to read a system's history before attempting a repair, because the problem that was visible was rarely the whole problem. He told her about Sandra without planning to. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough. The way he had learned to braid hair by failing at it repeatedly until the repetition became competence. The notes, lunch, the way grief he had found, was not something you resolved but something you learned to carry without breaking stride, which took much longer than anyone told you and was much more ordinary than anything suggested. Vivienne Ashford listened. She did not offer any of the reassurances that people sometimes reflexively offered, which he appreciated. When they left, they stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop in the particular November light that Southern Ontario produces, flat and silver and faintly melancholy, in a way that Theodore had always found oddly companionable. She gave him her card. He took it without ceremony. "He's going to ask about you," she said. "That's all right," Theodore said. He drove home along the lakeshore. June was in school. He had 4 hours before pickup. He stopped at the hardware store for a part he'd been meaning to get, and the auto shop 2 streets over, and then he went home and made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and did not drink it. He kept going back to the boy's face, not the grip of his hands, though that had been something, not even the words about the hockey song, though those had arrived with the specific quality of something dislodged from a shelf he hadn't known was there. It was the certainty, the absolute, uncalculated certainty of a child who has walked towards something safe and knows it without having to think about it. He had seen that once before. June, at 2 years old, lost momentarily in a department store, had looked up and found him in the crowd, and her face had gone from terror to complete calm in the space of a second. Not relief, something older than relief. The body's knowledge operating ahead of the mind's ability to articulate it. Children did not perform that. It was not possible to perform that. He thought about the cracked heat exchanger. He remembered, now, more of that night, the kitchen floor tiles. Terracotta, with a hairline crack near the baseboard that someone had filled imperfectly. The way the work had been more involved than the estimate, which happened with old systems. He had been there until nearly midnight. He had sung, because he always did, because it helped him pace the work, and also because silence in a house, that size had a particular weight to it, and he had found that filling it was better for everyone. He had not known a child was on the stairs. He had known the house was full of something heavy, and he had done the job, and he had gone home. Now he sat in his own kitchen and thought about what a child had carried forward from that night, in the place where memory becomes sensation, and what it meant that Finn had recognized it 4 years later in a hospital waiting room. He did not know what it meant with any precision, but he had learned, across the years, that the things he could not categorize cleanly were usually the things most worth paying attention to. He picked up Vivienne's card from where he'd placed it on the table and looked at it for a while. Then he put it down and went to get the part from the hardware store installed in the boiler at the city's East End station. Because the work order wasn't going to file itself, and because Theodore Vance had built his life on the principle that you dealt with what was in front of you and trusted that the rest would arrange itself into a pattern that made sense from far enough away. He texted June's school to confirm pickup. He got a thumbs up from the secretary. Some things, he thought, were just Tuesday. Vivian Ashford called 3 days later. She was brief about it, in the manner of someone who has decided something and does not want to spend more words on the decision than necessary. She said that Finn had asked about him every morning since the hospital. She said she had told Finn that Theodore was a person they knew who was good at his job and that good things sometimes came back around. She said Finn had accepted this and then asked, with the specific practicality of a 7-year-old, whether Theodore had a daughter. He does, Theodore said. He wants to know if she likes hockey, Vivian said. Theodore was quiet for a moment. She watches it every Saturday with me and has opinions about the power play that are more developed than most adults I know, he said. There was a pause on the other end that sounded, to Theodore's ear, like someone not quite laughing. Finn's therapist says he's been asking to talk about his father more this week, Vivienne said, more than he has in a year. Theodore didn't say anything to that. I'm not suggesting anything, she added. I know, he said. I just thought you should know. I appreciate it. Another pause. He found the song, she said, the hockey one. He played it 3 times at breakfast. Theodore did not have a response for that, either. He stood in his work truck in the parking lot of a city maintenance facility and looked out at the flat November lake and felt something move in him that he didn't try to name. Saturday, he said finally. There's a game. June watches it like it's a religious obligation. If Finn wanted to watch, and if you... He stopped in the way of a man who rarely overstates what he is offering. There's enough soup. Vivienne did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was slightly different, not softer exactly, but carrying less of the weight it had been carrying. He'll want to bring his team jersey, she said. June will want to argue about it, Theodore said. She has allegiances. Good, said Vivian Ashford, and for the first time since he'd met her in the waiting room of Lakeshore General, the word had nothing provisional about it. They came on Saturday. Finn walked through the front door of Theodore's house with his jersey on and his hands in his pockets, and the specific posture of a child who is attempting to seem less excited than he is, which is a posture no 7-year-old has ever successfully maintained for more than a minute. June came down the stairs, assessed Finn's jersey, and said with the air of someone extending diplomatic tolerance, "That's fine, but we should talk about the goaltending situation before the puck drops." Finn looked at her. "I know about the goaltending situation," he said. "Nobody knows enough about the goaltending situation," June said, and led him to the living room. Theodore and Vivienne stood in the front hallway and listened to the 2 children immediately and comprehensively disagree about defensive zone coverage, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "He ate breakfast this morning," Vivian said. "A real one. He hasn't done that in weeks." Theodore looked at her. She was looking at the living room doorway, where the sound of a 7-year-old now loudly explaining why his team's forward line was statistically superior was filtering through with the unself-conscious conviction of someone who has not yet learned that being wrong occasionally is the price of certainty. "He's going to be fine," Theodore said. He said it the way he said things he knew, not as a prediction, but as a statement about something he had already observed and found to be true. Vivian turned and looked at him, and her expression had the particular quality of someone encountering something they have been holding space for without knowing what shape it would take. She did not respond. She didn't need to. They watched the game together, all four of them, on a couch that was slightly too small, with soup that June declared was good, but that the crackers were wrong, which Theodore accepted and did not dispute, because she was not entirely wrong about the crackers. At one point in the second period, Finn leaned over and told Theodore, in the confidential tone of someone sharing significant information, that his dad used to smell like coffee and motor oil. "That sounds about right," Theodore said. "You smell like that too," Finn said in the manner of someone filing a useful observation. "Occupational," Theodore said. Finn considered this for a moment, then turned back to the game. Vivian, who had been sitting on Finn's other side, did not say anything, but Theodore, without looking at her, was aware of the small sound she made and the way she briefly brought her hand to her mouth and then returned it to her lap, and looked at the television with the focused attention of a woman giving herself a moment to put something down without making a production of it. He did not acknowledge it directly. He gave her the angle. In the third period, with the score tied and Finn and June both shouting contradictory advice at the television with equal confidence, Theodore got up to get more soup, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment alone, listening to the noise of the living room. He thought about Sandra. He thought about the kitchen floor, a long time ago, and the infant in the car seat, and the long arithmetic of reconstruction. He thought about what it meant to build a life that was smaller and slower than the one you'd imagined and find, eventually, that smaller and slower had been precisely the right dimensions. He filled the bowls. He went back to the living room. The game went to overtime. Nobody talked about anything important for the rest of the evening, and when Vivian and Finn finally put on their coats to leave, Finn stopped at the door and looked back at Theodore with the clear, unhurried gaze of a child who has arrived at a conclusion and sees no reason to dress it up. "Same time next week," he said. "If you want," Theodore said. Finn considered this formality for approximately 1 second. "Okay," he said, as though the matter had been on the table for some time and he was simply closing it. Vivienne looked at Theodore over her son's head. There was something in her expression that had been set down and was not going to be picked back up. Theodore met her eyes for a moment and said nothing, because nothing was needed. Nothing formal was arranged after that. There was no language applied to what the four of them had become by December, except the language of weekends and hockey games, and a standing argument between June and Finn about defensive strategy that neither of them had any intention of resolving. Theodore came to understand, across those weeks, that Vivian Ashford was not a woman who accepted comfort easily or offered it carelessly, and that everything she did carry was carried with a precision that came from having learned, the hard way, that imprecision had a cost. He respected that. They were careful with each other in the particular way of two people who have both survived something large and understand the value of what they have built from what was left. One evening in January, when the four of them had come in from the cold after a walk along the lakeshore path that June had proposed and Finn had agreed to with the air of someone making a strategic alliance, Finn took off his boots and his coat and stood in the hallway and looked around the house with the kind of attention he usually reserved for hockey statistics. "This place feels like the kitchen," he said. His mother looked at him. "What kitchen?" "Ours," he said, When you fixed it. He was talking to Theodore. It felt like that after, like something that was supposed to be working started working. Theodore crouched down to be at his level, the same way he crouched to look at a system's components from the angle that revealed the most. That's a good way to put it, he said. Finn nodded, satisfied, and went to find June. Vivian stood in the hallway with her coat still on and her hands at her sides, and she looked at Theodore with an expression that had shed the last of what she'd been carrying in front of it. He doesn't say things like that, she said quietly. He does now, Theodore said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and slightly surprised, the kind that comes when something arrives without warning and turns out to be welcome. Theodore had not heard her laugh before. It did not sound like something she did often. It sounded like something she had been keeping somewhere safe and had just remembered she was allowed to take out. He did not tell her that. Some things were better left where they landed.